Oh,
Nope, not yet.
welcome.
It's okay, now you are.
Welcome, everybody, to this presentation. I am Kay Mooney. Kay Mooney. I am the sabbatical minister and the executive director of the Unitarian Universalist Advocacy Network of Illinois. We are grateful that you have made this so sorry. I'm hearing myself. We are grateful that you've made time to learn with us this morning about what graduated tax is and why it is a fair choice for Illinois, as it is for most other states in the Union. We meet in a time when many things are happening that impact our world. There are fires and hurricanes. COVID is keeping us in this weird space of only being able to see one another in flat screen. There are elections, there are fights for justice in Kentucky that have bubbled over to other states as well they should, and beyond. There are many ways that we are being asked to show up in these days, and I am grateful that you took this time to be here. How we deal with money, how we gather it, how we spend it, how we live with the impact of these choices has a huge impact on our world. Let us find out how we can make a difference today through this presentation. Today's program is hosted by Unity Temple Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Oak Park. Since 1871, Unity Temple has stood as a living example of and a powerful voice for liberal religion in America. The event is co-sponsored, we're really excited about this, co-sponsored by A Just Harvest, whose mission is to fight poverty and hunger in the Rogers Park and greater Chicago community by providing nutritious daily meals while cultivating community and economic development and organizing across racial, cultural, and socioeconomic lines in order to create a more just society. Another co-sponsor, Community Renewal Society, transforming society towards greater social justice at the intersection of race and poverty. Faith in Place Action Fund, people of faith and conscience promoting political action for the environmental justice in Illinois. The Illinois Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is reuniting people across Illinois to challenge the evils of systemic racism, poverty, the war, economy, ecology, devastation, and the nation's distorted morality of religious nationalism. The League of Women Voters of Illinois, encouraging an informed and active participation in government and the works to influence public policy through education and advocacy. And finally, Vote Yes for Fair Tax. The old ways of taxing income in Illinois is unfair and inadequate. We can fix it. We hope that you will check out about all of these organizations. If you're watching this in YouTube, you'll find that in the bottom underneath the video, there's a description of this event, and there's probably a show more that you'll see there. If you click on that show more, you will see a ton of information about these co-sponsors that we have. You can click on those links later on to be taken to their sites and find out more about all of the amazing work that they are doing within our communities and beyond. I want to make a very special thank you to everybody that is participating, many of them from these organizations. They are spending an hour and a half with you today to try to make sure that we all know why this issue is so important and why we need to fix this in Illinois. Now I would like to bring on and welcome the Reverend Alan Taylor from Unity Temple. Alan Taylor has some introductions for us as well. Thank you, Reverend Taylor.
Good morning. I welcome you all on behalf of Unity Temple, Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I would be in the sanctuary right now if there wasn't construction, very loud construction right outside the building. But I want to acknowledge that on July 5th, I took the opportunity to preach a sermon called Acting for Fairness, in which I shared 3 levels that I discern how we can participate in democracy. The first level is to vote. The second is to use your voice and talk with others about what matters to you. And the third level of democracy is walking with others to stand collectively for specific changes of public policy and of the law. And how does a faith community engage these 3 levels of democracy? The first level is urging everyone to vote and becoming educated about the issues up for a vote and learning about the candidates. The second level is urging members to talk with others about what matters to them. But there is still a hesitancy to take a position, to take a stand. The third level of democracy for a faith community is to raise its collective voice, to take a position for the sake of our principles, and to stand with those who are directly affected. Now, many congregations don't like to participate in this third level of democracy because it makes some people uncomfortable knowing that a stand is being taken that isn't universally shared. And there are some congregations that on principle won't take any collective stands, affirming the value of preserving a space where all viewpoints are respected. But while that is a viable perspective, it clashes with the value of cultivating equity, compassion, and justice in all human relations. And that's a principle so important to us Unitarian Universalists. And I'm really proud of our congregation here at Unity Temple for stepping up to that third level of democracy. Here at Unity Temple, we have a Vote Love team that's headed by Scott Metzger and Judith McDevitt and Chuck Ruth. And I am grateful that Scott and Judith will share the stand that we have taken as a faith community. Scott and Judith.
Start video. The members of the Unity Temple Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Oak Park, Illinois, endorsed the proposed amendment to the Illinois Constitution that would allow the state to implement a graduated income tax, also known as the Fair Tax Amendment. As Unitarian Universalists, we are committed to bringing our values of justice, equity, and compassion to the public sphere. Justice and compassion demand that all Illinoisans have access to high-quality education and other human services. Equity requires that those who benefit the most in our society and those who are most able to pay bear their fair share of the burden to fund these services. Taxations and budgets are how our values as a people become policy. Thus, for Unitarian Universalists, a just and equitable system of taxation is a moral imperative rooted in our core values.
Illinois does not have a just and equitable system of taxation because its constitution mandates a flat income tax. As a result, income inequality has increased as lower income earners have had to bear a greater share of the tax burden than the rich. The state has made cuts to crucial services, denying many Illinoisans lives of safety, dignity, and opportunity to which they are entitled. Yet the state still finds itself in dire fiscal condition. Predictably, these inequities disproportionately impact people of color, and the catastrophic coronavirus pandemic has only exposed and worsened these problems. A graduated income tax is a necessary step toward creating a just, equitable, and compassionate society here in Illinois. Although the Illinois Constitution currently prohibits this fair and logical policy, Illinoisans have the chance to change that when they go to the polls on November 3rd. If the Fair Tax Amendment passes, Illinois will join the federal government and 32 other states, including most neighboring states, in implementing a more fair, equitable income tax. The Unity Temple Unitarian Universalist Congregation enthusiastically supports this ballot initiative and encourages all Illinoisans to vote yes for fair tax.
Thank you, Judith and Scott. We are among a number of congregations to vote yes, and I want to acknowledge it was the Unitarian Universalist Advocacy Network of Illinois and Community Renewal Society who have been working on this for the last few years and recognize that this is such a critical situation and that we need strong partners. And I'm delighted that we are that I have come into relationship with several other exciting individuals who are working on this throughout the Chicagoland area and throughout the state. So thank you, Reverend Kay, for your leadership.
Thank you so much, Reverend Allen. It's good to be with you in this fight. I'd like to invite now Ralph Martire to join us. Ralph is the Executive Director for the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, CTBA, a bipartisan 501c3 think tank committed to ensuring that state, federal, and local workforce, education, fiscal, economic, and budget policies are fair and just and promote opportunity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income class. In addition to Ralph Martire's role at CTBA, he is also the Arthur Rubeloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. During his time at CTBA, Ralph has obtained numerous legislative successes. I welcome him now and will share my screen as he is getting ready to help us to understand a little bit more about what the fair tax will look like and how we can make a change in our world. Thank you, Ralph.
Thanks, Kay. So thanks for inviting me. I am Ralph Martire, the Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. We are bipartisan, which means my board of directors has Democrats and Republicans on it that don't particularly like or trust each other at all. That's great for us at the staff level because we get to focus on best practices and data and ignore sort of right-wing or left-wing ideology. We just try to do what the data indicate and what the best practices indicate ought to be done. Now, this is a contentious issue because it involves taxes. But I have to say, the state's failure to have a graduated rate structure in its income tax has led to two of its most significant fiscal problems today. That is its underfunded pensions and the high reliance on property taxes to fund schools. And it frankly has put the state in a position where it cannot afford to invest in the core level of services needed to satisfy demographically driven need. So next slide, please. So I want to give you the budgetary context for the fair tax so you can understand why this is such an important initiative and really what kind of a difference it does make. So here's the general fund budget for the current fiscal year, the one we are living in. If you go to the very top line there, you see the state's going to spend $42.9 billion. However, we broke that spending down into its two component parts, the hard costs, which are things the state has to pay by law or by contract, and then the general fund service appropriations, where there's some discretion, but not as much as you would think. So start with that hard costs. Before anyone votes on anything, $14.8 billion was spent this year on things like debt service to bondholders, the pension contribution, which is the subject of a statutory transfer out. There are a number of other statutory transfers out where the money comes into the general fund and goes out to like a Medicaid trust fund or a local government distributive fund, et cetera. And those add up to like 2.1 billion this year. And then there's the group health insurance liability for state workers. That's 14.8 billion the state has to spend, no discretion. The way the state voted to spend your money was to allocate 96 cents out of every dollar to really four core services: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. And education has a couple of subcategories, right? It has early childhood, it has K-12, it has higher ed, but that's where your state money goes. And while at the top line there, if you look at general fund service appropriations, item number 3, they appropriated $29 billion to spend on those core services this year. They're not going to spend that much. That's because if you go down to the penultimate line, unspent appropriations, $1 billion of what's been appropriated won't be spent. We just don't know which of the service areas are going to be reduced, but we do know net expenditures on services are $28 billion. A little more context. If 96% of our expenditures are going to those 4 core services, that means only 4% of the budget covers everything else. Covers economic development, environmental protection, the park, central management services, the constitutional officers. I mean, a lot of people claim that Illinois could solve some of its fiscal problems by rearranging or getting better priorities. Really? Which of these priorities ought to be taken off the list? Folks that make those claims really don't understand the state budget, number one. Number two, we are a low spending state compared to our peers in all of these areas. And unfortunately, because of our tax policy, we cannot afford our current level of investment in these services. How do I know that? Next slide. Here's our accumulated deficit for this fiscal year and what will come into next fiscal year. And this is eye-opening. So we're starting the year, just go to the very top line there, with $42.9 billion in revenue. Now that's a good thing. That's exactly what we're going to spend. So it sounds like we have a balanced budget, but we don't. Let's walk down what's coming out of that revenue. First thing are those hard costs identified on the prior slide, $14.8 billion. Subtract that out, that leaves a balance of $28.1. Okay, now here's what wasn't accounted for on the prior slide, and it really isn't accounted for in any public sector reporting, and that is their carry forward accumulated deficit. That's a fiscal term for unpaid bills that are going to impact the next fiscal year. So at the end of fiscal year 20, the state had $8.4 billion in unpaid bills. We have to get rid of all those before the end of this fiscal year. So any carry forward debt from the prior year in unpaid bills, carry forward deficit, becomes a charge on your current revenue in the next fiscal year. So let's take that $8.4 billion out. That leaves $19.7 billion in revenue to cover current services. They are going to spend $28.1, meaning the deficit in unpaid bills anyway remains relatively stable at about $8.4 billion. However, there's another curveball in this year's budget caused by the pandemic. The economic downturn created by COVID-19 has driven down Illinois' revenues, just like it's driven down revenues for the entire nation. According to the National Governors Association, actually, the 50 states collectively are looking at $600 billion revenue loss because of COVID-19 this year. Well, our revenue loss is $5 billion, and the way the state is making up for that this year is borrowing $5 billion from the feds under a program that's providing some coronavirus relief. So in that $42 billion revenue figure is $5 billion of loan proceeds. So now those loan proceeds aren't available in fiscal year 2022 next year. And in fact, they're going to have to be repaid over a 3-year period. So in addition to the carry forward unpaid bills, there is a revenue gap going into next year of $5 billion, meaning the deficit next year starts with is $13.4 billion. Now, how significant is that? If the state literally just wanted to flat fund its services, same dollar amount in fiscal year 22 as were invested in fiscal year 21, it'd be short of the revenue needed to do that by almost 50%. So that's our current fiscal condition, which obviously is not so good. Now, how did we get here? Well, some of it's COVID-19, but that $8.4 billion is not about COVID-19. What's that about? Next slide, please. That's about what's called a structural deficit. And this is very easy to understand. This projection, go to the far left-hand part of the screen there. It starts in fiscal year 2019. It assumed the state actually had a balanced budget that year, i.e. its revenues and expenditures were precisely equal. They weren't. The deficit was around $7.88 billion, but let's just assume that it was. If revenues and expenditures were equal, and you just adjust for historic rates of inflation and population change, and you assume a normal economy, so this is not adjusted to account for the impact COVID-19 is having. This is assuming a normal economy. Will your current law on revenue generation, your tax policy, continue to support your current level of services into the future? So that's if you don't add or expand one program. Just do tomorrow what you do today, just pay off your debt. Well, the yellowy, greeny, ugly line at the top, I don't know what color that is, but whatever color that is, that's our cost projection going forward. The red line is our revenue projection. And the gap between revenue growth and service cost growth is a structural deficit. It's literally built into the structure of our fiscal policy. Now, Illinois has had one of these for generations, since at least the late 60s, early 70s. The response to this by elected officials hasn't been entirely responsible. And my organization's bipartisan, so I could say this is a bipartisan problem for sure. So the real ways to solve a structural deficit sustainably would be to either cut your expenditures all the way down to your revenues every single year. Well, that means cutting significantly education, health, social services, and public safety every single year. Right now, if we wanted to do that, we'd have to cut $8.4 billion from our expenditures in those areas. Not good policy by any stretch of the imagination. Also not politically viable. Or you raise your tax revenue up to support your expenditures. Now, while that's responsible, it's also politically contentious. So what has happened in Illinois specifically, two things. Number one, the state said, hey, we share the obligation with locals to fund public education. Let's just push the primary responsibility away from the state and down to local school districts to pay for education. That's why your property taxes are high. Your property taxes are high in Illinois because the state of Illinois does not adequately fund education, and it does not adequately fund education from state-based resources because it doesn't have the resources. Okay, it has a structural deficit and had it for years. The second thing the state decided to do was say, you know, we have this long-term obligation to fund our pensions. Well, that's a long-term obligation. Let's just not do it. So for, once again, years, the state intentionally didn't put into the pension system what's called the normal cost. That is the cost of funding the benefits being earned. And instead wrote an IOU to the pension system, took the money that should have gone to the pensions to fund normal costs, instead used it to support service expenditures and hide the structural deficit a little bit from voters and taxpayers. Well, that's borrowing to spend, and it's highly irresponsible. And over time, that borrowing to spend catches up with you, and it has caught up with us now. So that's sort of a quick snapshot of where we are fiscally. So let's determine whether or not the structural deficit was caused by overspending or bad revenue policy. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so there's never been any data to support the contention that Illinois' fiscal problems are caused by overspending. Just no data have ever supported that. This table really demonstrates that, I think, incredibly clearly. Go to the column in the far left-hand side. That's the FY 2000 enacted general fund budget, FY 2000, 2 decades ago. And there you see the dollar amounts committed to where 96% of our service expenditures go, education, health, social services, et cetera. And then total expenditures at the bottom. The very next column simply adjusts those expenditures for inflation and puts it in today's dollars. So just take the top line, K-12 education. If you wanted to make an equal investment in K-12 education today, as you did in the year 2000, you'd have to be putting in $8.2 billion, because after inflation and changes in population, $4.6 billion expenditure in 2000 is equal to an $8.2 billion expenditure today. The third column is just the state's actual budget number. Now remember, these are inflated by $1 billion. The state's only going to spend $28 billion, but it appropriated $29 billion. So some of these are going to be cut below the levels indicated here. We just don't know what's going to be reduced during the course of the year yet. And the last two columns are whether or not we're spending more or less in dollar amount and by percentage after 20 years and after adjusting for inflation in real terms. Let's go to the bottom right-hand corner. Today in Illinois, we're going to spend 20% less on education, health, social services, and public safety than we did in the year 2000, 2 decades ago, after you adjust for inflation in real terms. 20% less. That is hardly driving our deficit problems. We have been cutting spending in real terms for a long period. And in fact, we were cutting spending in nominal dollars, not even adjusting for inflation, for the period between 2009, the end of the Great Recession, right up until last year. This is the first year in nominal dollars we're actually going to spend more on these items than we did in the year 2009. So spending has never been the driver of our fiscal problems in Illinois. And I'll highlight the two areas that have an increase, are tiny increases. So top one, K-12, that only got a 1.39% increase over 20 years. And All that increase happened in the last 3 years because of the state's new school funding formula, the evidence-based model, which has a target for enhancing state investment in K-12 every year by at least $300 million over the prior year. If I was given this presentation last year, the number would still be negative. So because they made it again last year, they finally got past the point where they're spending a little bit more now than they did in the year 2000. That's the good news. Here's the bad news. The evidence-based model ties school funding into covering the costs of those practices which have a statistically meaningful correlation to enhancing student achievement. So we actually just now in Illinois will only fund what works or fund what works. And based on the evidence of what works, our current funding level for K-12 education statewide, including state and local resources, is $7 billion short of what's needed. So it's great that they made a little increase over the last 3 years. We're still nowhere near meeting need. Same thing for early childhood. Early childhood is up by 81%. That's a significant increase. That's a really good investment of taxpayer money. Literally all the research and data show that it saves us taxpayers money in healthcare and education costs and criminal justice costs over time. Investing in early childhood is really a wonderful thing. There's no contrary data. The good news is we've done a better job of that over the years. Bad news is we're going to put $544 million into early childhood this year, and that is well short of meeting demand, which is over $3 billion. So, you know, good news, bad news, it is Illinois. If you look at the third line on higher education, that's been cut by almost 50% in real terms. It's actually going to get less in nominal dollars this year than it did in the year 2000. Because of this, our increase in tuition costs for students attending public universities in Illinois has outstripped the growth on the national average by 50 percentage points. So spending clearly isn't the driver of our fiscal problem. How about revenue? Next slide, please. In 2021, before the impact of COVID-19 and after you adjust for inflation, our revenue finally got back to the same level it was at in the year 2000. Why is that eye-opening? In the year 2000, our income tax rate was 3%. It's currently 4.95% higher. And our corporate income tax rate was 4.8%, it's currently 7%, much higher. So the bottom line is without those tax increases, our revenue today on an inflation adjusted basis would still be well below where it was in fiscal year 2000, 2 decades ago. In fact, we know how far below it would be. Next slide, please. It'd be about $7-8 billion less if we just kept the same rates. So those tax increases are the only reason our revenue actually returned to the level it was in 2000 on an inflation adjusted basis. In other words, that structural deficit, which has driven up your property taxes and created the unfunded pension liability, is precisely the cause of bad tax policy that doesn't work in the modern economy, doesn't generate adequate revenue. And in fact, we've been cutting our expenditures for 2 decades in real terms on core services because of our bad tax policy. So if we don't fix our tax policy, we're not going to get out of this mess. I'm just going to give you a couple of data points on the property tax. Next slide, please. So this compares the portion of education funding covered by property taxes versus state-based taxes in Illinois versus the rest of the country. And what you can see, Illinois here is in the red, the rest of the country on average is in blue. Local property taxes, go to the comparison in the far left. They cover 67% of the cost of public education in Illinois. The national average is only 45%. And go to state-based revenue, like from the income and sales, those things. In Illinois, state-based revenue only covers 24%. On average, a state will cover 46%. We are literally the outlier in both cases. So we rely more on property taxes to fund K-12 education than any other state. We rely less on state tax revenue. Why? We have a structural deficit. So every year we can afford to do slightly less than the year before. And until the evidence-based funding formula created that target requiring the state to pump in a little bit more every single year, 300 million more every year, the state was literally shifting the primary obligation down to local property taxes to fund school because it just didn't have the money to do it at the state-based level. Next slide, please. Well, that's a horribly unfair way to tax people. So 1990 through 2018, we just looked back that period of time, and we adjusted for inflation. Property taxes in the state of Illinois grew by almost 70% in that period of time in real terms, whereas The personal income, median income only grew by 11%. So property taxes are growing by 6 to 7 times the rate of growth in income for most people. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There you go. Property tax also a lousy way to tax business. This is a study by Ernst & Young, and you could see property taxes comprise almost 46% of all taxes paid by businesses, whereas the business income tax is only 4%, very little. So next slide. And there's the pension ramp, and that's the unfunded pension liability, and that's what's straining fiscal resources. I'm going to highlight here. You put those two bars together, that's the total pension payment the state has to make annually. The pink bar is the normal cost of funding services. The blue bar is the irresponsible debt repayment plan passed in 1995. Obviously, it's that debt repayment plan that's killing the state. It is not the cost of funding benefits. Next slide. So if we're going to fix our tax system to fund current services, the first place we need to look is our income tax, because our income tax doesn't respond to the modern economy, doesn't tax people fairly. And in fact, it's contrary to sound principles of capitalist tax policy. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but to get down to the key point, Adam Smith, the gentleman who invented capitalism and the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, said that taxes ought to be designed to, quote unquote, go to the bottom here, remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. The only tax that could do that's the income tax, and then only if it has a graduated rate structure. Why? Every other tax and fee available to fund services at the state and local level is regressive. It takes more of the income of a lower moderate earning family than it does of a more affluent earning family. So does this sort of approach to taxation, using a graduated rate structure for an income tax that shifts some tax burden to the top over the bottom middle, make sense given how incomes are distributed in the current economy? And the answer is yes. Next slide, please. This is Illinois specific data. This is based on what us in Illinois report to the federal government, the IRS, on our tax returns. We're going over a 40-year period. The growth in income, go to the comparison on the far left there. The wealthiest 1% in our state saw their average income over this period of time increase from $411,000 a year to $1.4 million. This is after inflation in real terms. That's an increase of 254%. Go to the second comparison on the right. The bottom 99%, so everybody else, saw their average income increase from $51,000 to $61,000, an increase of only 20%. And in fact, the bottom 90% saw their incomes declining. That real incredible growth in income inequality can't be responded to by any tax other than a graduated rate income tax that could assess higher rates on higher levels of income and lower rates on lower levels of income. Every other tax misses this growth in the economy and forces most of the tax burden on that bottom 99% who are not seeing much wage growth, income growth over time, and missing imposing tax burden on the top. This is why the flat income tax results in a system that is both unfair and non-responsive to the economy. And when you have both of those flaws, you hurt your economic activity and you have ongoing deficits. So next slide, please. Here's a quick picture of how unfair the taxing system currently is in Illinois. Everyone in the bottom 20, 40, 60, 80% pay a greater percentage of their income in state and local taxes than do the wealthiest spend, 1%. And that's because the mix of taxes is highly regressive, and that regressivity is not offset by an income tax that has a graduated rate structure, which is literally the only tax that can do that. Next slide, please. So our failure to have a graduated rate structure actually worsens income inequality. I'm just going to talk about the comparison here on the far left. So what the blue bar shows you is before you apply Illinois taxes, the wealthiest 1% in Illinois have an average income that's 137 times greater than the average income for the bottom 20%. However, after you apply Illinois income taxes, all taxes, what you see is the average income for the wealthiest 1% jumps to 149 times greater than the average income for the bottom 20%. We literally worsen income inequality, and in the worst way, in take-home pay. That's bad fiscal policy, it's bad economic policy, and it certainly isn't fair. Next slide, please. So real quick about the graduated rate tax that's on the table now. There are two elements to the fair tax. This November, you get to vote on an amendment to the state constitution that permits a graduated rate structure. Doesn't require one, by the way. The state could use a flat rate structure if it chose to, and it doesn't specify any specific thing other than you could have a graduated rate structure or a flat rate structure. It just makes it permissive. Then there's actually been enabling legislation that's already been passed that says if this amendment gets ratified, then on January 1st of 2021, here's your new rate structure. And what you see it does, I highlighted that 4.95% tax rate in the middle. That's our current flat rate. And it clearly cuts the tax rate on most income for most tax filing. So whether you're single or married filing jointly, this is your taxable income. You can see 86% of our tax filers report taxable income below $100,000, and all of that income will be taxed at lower rates than the current flat rate. And the current flat rate is only exceeded when incomes get above, or taxable income gets above $250,000. Next slide, please. So this actually is a relatively rational proposal. It cuts taxes for 97% of the taxpayers in Illinois, and only the wealthiest 3% will get a tax increase. It raises, if we didn't have a COVID-19 economy, $3.6 billion, and its top rate of 7.9%, 7.99%, I should say, compares favorably to other states. Just go real quickly to the next slide, please. And it actually works. So the blue line here shows you tax burden as a percentage of income under current law. The orange line is how it would change under the fair tax. Note that it just flattens the unfairness. It doesn't even eliminate all of it because our system is so unfair. But the wealthiest 1%, due to their tax burdens go up, and 9.8%, still the lowest tax burdens in the state. This is not a crazy eat the rich strategy. This is rational tax policy. It solves numerous problems in our state's fiscal system. It makes total sense, and even makes sense to do right now during a down economy. And I'll talk about that later during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for taking an incredibly complex subject and trying to reduce it into a very short presentation. Ralph did an hour-long presentation for us earlier in July. If you want more information, I encourage you to go out to our YouTube channel at UUANI. That's Unitarian Universalist Advocacy Network of Illinois, and watch that. It is very complete and fabulous presentation. We turn now to our first panel, who will explore the impact the current budget has had on our communities. Our panelists include the Reverend Dr. Joseph Joe Mitchell. He is the senior pastor of the New Hope Missionary Baptist Church in DeKalb. Pastor Joe and his wife will celebrate 19 years of marriage in October. God has blessed them with 3 beautiful children. He serves as a vice president of the DeKalb County Community Foundation Board of Directors, DCCF. It is an organization dedicated to enhancing the quality of life in DeKalb County, Illinois, by proactively addressing community needs and expanding, managing, and distributing philanthropic resources. Locally, Pastor Joe has worked hard in the community on issues of diversity, food security, housing, and equal distribution of local government resources. Dr. Mitchell was the 2015 recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Award given by the Northern Illinois University, and the 2019 recipient of the Service to the Community Award by the local Democratic Party. Recently, Mitchell started a new journey as an adjunct instructor at Northern Illinois University's Center for Black Studies. As humble servant of Jesus Christ, Pastor Joe tirelessly dedicates himself to empowering others and advancing the kingdom of God. Welcome, Pastor Joe. The Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagán-Banks is an ordained minister with the United Church of Christ and serves as the local pastor in Chicago. Pagán-Banks is committed to the liberation of oppressed peoples, building power, and creating community. The overall economic and community development work of A Just Harvest, where Pagán-Banks works as the executive director, is to increase economic sustainability by utilizing the assets, gifts, and abilities already present within the community. A Just Circle, caring for, investing in returning citizens looking to embody success, is a program of A Just Harvest response to reduce recidivism and violence by addressing the needs for dignified and safe employment for our young adult neighbors who are under negative pressure on a daily basis from the state and peers alike. the Reverend Brian, I'm going to mess this up, Sauder is President and Executive Director of Faith in Place and Faith in Place Action Fund. His passion for environmental justice motivates his work funding to grow a vision of faith in place. The Faith in Place Action Fund develops and advocates for legislation, regulations, and government programs to care for the earth, a social welfare organization. It mobilizes Illinois people of diverse faiths to take action on issues that affect the well-being of our neighbors and future generations. Welcome. Sarah Youssef is the Associate Director of City and County Policy for Community Renewal Society. Sarah leads legislative efforts around the Just Housing Initiative and advises the community development team around current housing and employment policies at the local level. Sarah is currently working with a team of people from CRS and the community around police accountability. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Reverend Joe, Reverend Brian, and Reverend Marilyn and Sarah. I hand it off to your very capable presence, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Kay. So as Kay mentioned, this panel focuses on the impact that the fair tax will have on our communities. Why does the fair tax matter in these times? We'll get to specific questions around this issue, but before I get to those questions, I just want to lay out a few guidelines for the discussion. Panelists, as you begin, I invite you to remember to limit your response to 2 minutes so that all of you can participate in the discussion. I'll go ahead and ask a question and feel free to answer if you're so inclined. If we have time afterwards, we welcome questions from viewers. Just drop it in the chat and we're going to do our best to get to them. So let's just dive right in. The first question I have is in regards to the tax system that we currently have in place right now, the flat tax. You've just heard this amazing presentation from Mr. Martire. And how does this relate? What is the impact of the current tax system, particularly as it relates to revenues for social services? How would you say our current tax system impacts the work that you do right now?
So thank you, Sarah, for that question. And I'll go ahead and answer first. And again, thank you for this opportunity to share today. I think it's important for folks to understand why we support this fair tax. And I want to say that A Just Harvest has been working on this with the coalition for over 10 years now, because we understand that we are not facing a budget crisis in Illinois. We are facing a revenue crisis in Illinois. We've been saying that for years, and folks don't want to hear that, right? They just want to slash programs. They think that we spend too much, that we care too much about our communities and those who really need our support and our services. And so how that shows up for us is the fact that folks are having to come outside of their own homes, even after working 2 and 3 jobs, not making enough money, and have to come and get food from us, right? They come and they have to get hot meals from us, or they're getting groceries from us. And we're grateful to be able to provide that service. But it's also a shame that folks who are working so hard aren't earning enough in the first place, and then have to pay the same amount that corporations that do have the ability to pay more are not paying more, or people, not just corporations. And so just realizing that folks want to be able to provide for their own families. They want to make sure that they have stable and dignified housing. They want to have good education for their kids. And, in my neighborhood, our school is constantly facing closure because of low enrollment, because not enough resources, because of the changes that happen in the community. But if the state's not going to help support education, and our property taxes are doing that, but you live in a community where there aren't enough resources going into the school, it just becomes this ugly, ugly cycle. And it's time for the state to make a change to make sure that the wealthy are paying their fair share, corporations are paying their fair share, and that we're making sure that our communities who actually spend more in the community, they spend more in the community, keep the wealth in the community, are able to, have the resources they need for their families.
Reverend Sauder or Reverend Mitchell, how's this impacted you right now with our current system?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Thank you for the question. Thank you for all this good information. It's a delight to be on this panel with such amazing intellects and to explore this together. You know, for us at the Faith and Place Action Fund, you know, we think a lot about pollution, and pollution thrives on poverty. Pollution follows the path of least resistance into communities where there is a disproportionate rate of air pollution. There's a disproportionate rate of lead pipes. There's a disproportionate rate of flooding, access to local food. So when we think about social services in the community, we got to think about public health and how do we make our communities more healthy? How do we reduce the air pollution that causes the asthma rates? How do we reduce the basement flooding that's causing all sorts of harm with sort of the mold that happens and just the upset of daily rhythms and daily life? And we rely on our government to protect us from pollution. And the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, that is their job. And when Ralph is walking through how the fair tax will help fund the protective services of the government, this is important for us. Like we need the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency to enforce the standards for healthier communities that we have. And currently we don't have that. Unfortunately, the budget of the Illinois EPA has been slashed systematically over the years. The funding that comes into that department is paid for by polluters. Polluters pay fees for permits. And then you have a problem where the government agency is trying to enforce safeguards funded by the very people they're trying to prevent from having that pollution happens. So this is a systemic issue, and it's a systemic issue for us at the Action Fund, where we know we have to deal in the realm of budgets. That's why we as a political action organization working on environmental justice have to be talking about the fair tax, because the fair tax directly impacts the government agency that's seeking out to protect our communities. So if we want to move the burden of pollution and what it means for healthier communities, we have to be advocating strong for the fair tax together and highlighting these stories of air pollution, highlighting these stories of lead and the impacts of lead, of basement flooding, of access to local food. Really, we got to be connecting the dots. And who better? I'll say the last thing, and then we're a bunch of preachers on this panel, so that 2-minute thing is a little hard. But who better than the faith community to lead the way, right? We as a faith community, we know how to reimagine what a healthy community looks like. We know that we want good food, we want music, we want laughter, we want ability to share and joy and sing together. And we can't do that unless we have the safeguards that we need in place. And those safeguards are what our democracy and our government's all about. And the fair tax is a pathway for that.
Thank you for sharing that. Reverend Mitchell, I don't know. Well, oh, I think you're breaking up a little bit. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, can you all hear me?
Yes. So just your thoughts again on the.
Good morning, excited to participate with this esteemed group today on a very important conversation. I can't say it any better than about taxation, budgeting, and the distribution of funds. It has to have a moral foundation to it. And currently right now, there's a lot of immorality as it relates to how we tax and how we budget and how we distribute those funds. When we talk about the immorality of it, we're putting a burden on poor people. We're putting a burden on those who are disenfranchised. We're putting a burden on oppressed people, which it should not be. If we look at it from a faith perspective, those are the ones that we've been called to liberate. Those are the ones we've been called to help, to lift up and not put more on their shoulders. And I'm really concerned in the time that we're living in today, there's this false narrative about poor people that they're lazy, and that can be nothing but further from the truth. We have what's called in America right now a working poor class. We have families, you have people in households working 2 and 3 jobs trying to make ends meet. Number one, because they're not paid a living wage. And too many people are having to decide, do we get the car fixed? Do we buy groceries, or do we pay the mortgage? And that's a sin before God, in my humble opinion, in the richest nation in the world. And I believe the fair tax is a way how we start to address and make things more equitable for everyone. For too long, we've given big businesses, those who can afford it, tax breaks. And that makes no sense to me whatsoever. Corporations, businesses that are making millions and billions of dollars should not be getting tax breaks. They should be the ones paying their fair share. The Holy Scriptures that I read says that who much is given, much is required. And so if you have been blessed financially with much is required of you as well, to make sure that we have an equitable system that ensures social services, our education system, is funded in the right way. So no matter based on your zip code, no matter based on your social economic status, everyone is getting an equal education, a righteous education that really just makes our nation a better place.
Thank you. And it's true, it just sounds like with what Mr. Martire was saying too, with taxing people, the people who have the most money and income, that will help our state in so many ways. And so this kind of leads to the next question of with this increase in revenue that we're expecting to get from passing the fair tax, how would those resources, how do you see that impacting your community? What can we do with that, with those resources? What would we like to see with that?
I guess I can go first again. When I think about our community, those resources can go into job development, job training, creating new business opportunities. Again, back to making sure our schools are fully funded and our young folks have access to all that they need to have a quality education. But then also just the support systems that are already in place, that they be funded in a way that make sure that no one falls through the cracks, right? Right now, there's such a hustle that has to happen around folks having access to their benefits, making sure benefits aren't cut midstream, make sure they don't mess up or miss out on some opportunity because of paperwork or requirements, like really having things in place, enough offices open, enough caseworkers, enough access to mental health, all those things that just, if the things aren't in place or fully funded, there's not enough support for the folks who are needing to access those things. And then there's just such a possibility for folks to get lost in the system, to give up on the system. People who need it the most often give up and say, you know what, forget it. I don't have time to deal with that, or can't get through. And then their kids go hungry. I know families where kids go hungry, or their kids have to sleep in their car or on auntie's couch because they couldn't pay the rent. Or just, not too long ago, one of the young men who died in that fire on Lakeshore Drive was one of our interns. And he had just asked me about getting back into our workforce development program, but because we don't have enough resources, we can't expand it right now. And I'm not saying that that's connected to why he was in that car and he got killed, but it's just an example of there are folks who are wanting to work and wanting to turn their lives around. And if we're not able to provide the service because of such limited resources, we lose our, not lose like they just go someplace else. Young folks are dying, right? Kids are going hungry. Seniors are dying. And this is a matter of life or death. And so we have to make sure that our services are fully funded so that people who need them as a life-saving, support have access to them fully, not just this kind of half-ass, not this kind of, get what you can kind of thing, and you got to rob Peter to pay Paul. We ought not behave like that. Again, like Pastor Mitchell said, the richest country in the world, and Illinois and Chicago is supposed to be such a premier place, and we cannot allow the wealthy to hold us ransom to, some of these corporations that say they're going to leave if they have to pay more, and they want to, it's like they're, trying to hold us ransom, or, we can't allow that. We can't allow it. We got to speak truth to that and make sure that our folks are taken care of.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Just comments with these thoughts. I'm in DeKalb, which is about 60 miles west of Chicago. College Town, Northern Illinois University is here, and we have seen a major increase in violent crime here this year that we have not seen before. Just had a meeting with the city manager and the police chief on How do we address this? And no different than what we're seeing in Chicago, we cannot police our way out of this. Policing is not the answer. Putting more police in neighborhoods is not the answer. If you pay attention at all to where this activity is happening in Chicago, and it's concentrated here in our community, it's concentrated to impoverished and oppressed community and areas. What we really need is not more policing. We need more resources. We need more access to mental health. We need more access to fresh vegetables. The community where it's happening in my community right now, it's recognized by the FDA as a food desert. And the centralized in this desert, there's 2 gas stations and 2 liquor stores, centralized, and there's no grocery store. There's nowhere to get fresh food. You can get all the Funyuns you want, all the pop you want, all the donuts you want, but you can't get any vegetables. And so I believe if we can pass this fair tax, it allows additional resources to come into communities where it's needed, where we can create job training programs, so we can have more people have access to mental health care, where we can create more access to after school programs to ensure our children have the best education possible. And so I see those all as positive things when we have the dollars and the resources and we distribute them in the way that's needed to uplift those.
Amen. I just want to give a hearty amen to Reverend Marilyn and Reverend Joe. I think they got it. I'll just give a little bit more context from Faith in Place Action Fund's standpoint. We just really, through Faith in Place, we gave out $82,000 to faith communities all across Illinois, Central Illinois, here in Chicago, up in Waukegan and Lake County, in the suburbs, who are doing food crisis response. And just to give you a sense of scale, we were able to raise that $82,000 to help get food to people during the pandemic as a food crisis is just being exacerbated in economically challenged communities. And we had over $500,000 in application, and that was from the faith communities who had the means to put together a 2-page application. So the need is great. And not only do we need response, our faith communities are stepping up in this gap to provide food crisis response, but we need to be thinking on a governmental level, how do we build resiliency in the system, right? How do we look at these areas that are food insecure, build up the local food infrastructure that brings jobs? We know that unemployment in communities that are economically disadvantaged, was like 20%, 25%. Now we have neighborhoods in Chicago here that are 40%, 45% because of the pandemic. So how do we make sure that we're building food resiliency while creating access to jobs? And Reverend Joe, I'm with you. For returning individuals coming out of the prison pipeline system, for foster care alumni who are at high risk for going into the prison system, we can reduce recidivism rates while building a just economy, while building local food resiliency. But we need the funding at the government level to do that. We have amazing ideas as people of faith and conscience in community. We know the need that needs to happen. What we need is the funding to come in an equitable and just way so that we can move the programs forward. And in that way, we can start to connect the dots, between this high unemployment, between the food insecurity that we're seeing in communities, and making sure that it's a healthy community, right? To come back to, what do we want all of our communities to be? This is of utmost importance for us. And it begins with each of us, taking action, but also speaking out and working with our policymakers to ensure that justice is made possible.
What really strikes me from hearing from all of you is just, what we like, all the lack of resources we currently have, and then incredible need. I live in Lawndale, for example. We have 2 parks in the Little Village area. One park is right next to the jail. So you get to see people who are in jail, locked up, with kids playing in this one green space that we have. And again, I was just it really was significant to me to hear that the poorest people have the hugest burden of taxes as well. Not only do we have to, share and suffer through all these other hardships, but then there's also this huge thing about we're paying so much into the state, and what are we getting back? And so with that, I actually want to kind of lead into the next question, which is, if the fair tax does not pass, what will happen in your community? What does this mean if we don't get it passed?
Well, Sarah, I want to jump in and just kind of build off of, because our parks and our state parks, our local parks are so important. And, you know, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is a great example on the state level of a department that's been systematically defunded over the years and is really struggling. And one of the impacts of COVID that we're all waking up to is how important for our mental health it is to get outside and to go to our state parks. And right now, the state parks in Illinois, you know, there's tons of people going out because we've been sheltered in place and we're feeling that social isolation. We're struggling with our mental health, and so we're getting outside. But now the state parks have to, like, you know, restrict how many people can be in each park because the funding isn't there. So all of these things are connected. And I guess back to your question, Sarah, you know, like, if this doesn't pass, we continue down this pathway of injustice. We continue down this pathway of advancing racist policies, right? We continue down this pathway of ensuring that what our state constitution calls for, healthier communities for all of us, isn't enacted. So this is a really important issue that not only covers food security, not only covers reducing pollution in communities, but also has to do with our mental health and our ability to thrive as communities, as individuals. So I just wanted to pick up on that state park piece because I think that's so important. That's a good tangible example of the way the fair tax additional revenue can be used to bolster things that makes all of our lives better. And if we don't have that fair tax in place, then we continue down the same sort of pathway of trying to figure out how we get more permit fees in to fund these sort of things. And it's just a struggle. So this is, to me, this is common sense. This makes all the sense in the world. We can move forward. There's nothing radical about it, similar to other states. I mean, Ralph broke it just really down, really clear that this is something that really advances justice and is a win-win.
And I thank you for that, especially around the idea of thinking about our mental health and things like that. But, you know, the other, you know, if it doesn't pass, then the bad practice of trying to balance the budget on the backs of the poor will continue, right? We think that to balance the budget means to continue to cut services, and that's not going to work. We were serving over 150 people a day pre-COVID. And we're continuing to see those numbers rise on top of now doing emergency grocery deliveries because of COVID. And, you know, we're talking thousands of deliveries of groceries. And that's, if we don't change the system, it's just going to get worse because there's just less access, as has already been shared. And then with the, you know, with COVID and the shifting in jobs or how people are able to work and show up or care for their families, and, you know, making sure that their kids are taken care of, or if they're caring for someone who's elderly or sick, all those services that were so important and so vital to the very life and livelihood of our communities were already impacted pre-COVID. And now it's just, you know, even more exasperated. So if this doesn't pass and we continue to slash budgets in terms of our programming, our communities are just going to continue to just suffer. And like I said earlier, these are issues they're a matter of life or death.
Yep, can't say it any better than my two other panelists have said. It's an interesting thing when we look at when things are cut, it doesn't affect the wealthy. When things are cut, it doesn't affect those who are rich. When we start making cuts, it affects those who are the most vulnerable. And for me, that's immoral in itself. So when we start making cuts, we're talking about cutting social services. We're talking about cutting transportation. We're talking about cutting access to food. We're talking about cutting access to healthcare. None of those things will affect the wealthy. They will always be able to get those things. But middle class and poor people will struggle the most when we start making cuts. And again, like my two co-panelists have said, that just puts us in a more scary place in this country, in this nation, when those who need it the most don't have access to, and what they will have to turn to get it. And so again, I'm very concerned. It's been said several times, this is very rational, this is very moral, and it really will help put us as a state in a much better place. It was interesting when I was doing my research before coming on this, and just checking out some numbers. Illinois is only one of 9 states that don't already have this. And so we're really behind the curve already. Others have already seen the morality of doing this and saying this is the right thing to do. Our border states have it already. So when we see these commercials that are talking about people leaving Illinois because of this, well, they're going somewhere that's already had this. And so they're not telling the truth. They're not really giving a equitable picture of what this looks like and how other states have already done this and how Illinois is really behind the curve.
That was very powerful. And on that, I would just ask right now for us to have just some final thoughts. If we can just keep it really brief, though, I would ask for a minute. You all speak so eloquently and you have so much to say, but if we could just wrap this up and what is it that you would like to share with our audience today? Tax.
Yeah, I'll jump in and just say, for those who are watching, scribble down one family member or one friend you're going to talk to about the fair tax, right? Like take the information you learned today. I'm excited. I'm fired up. Reverend Joe, Reverend Marilyn, you got me going. Sarah, your questions have prompted us. I mean, I'm like, who am I going to call, right? And talk to, hey, do you know about the fair tax? It's going to be on the ballot in November. Here's what it's about. Here's what I learned this morning. Just, one person, if we all kind of pick one person, I think that will make a huge difference.
Brian Stevenson says that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's justice. And so I think just reminding folks, one, that this won't affect the majority of folks, 97% of folks won't be affected. And just reminding folks, that we are asking them to be a part of the investment into the well-being of all of our communities, all of our people, right? And to think about it in that way. And again, to whom much is given, much is required. So to go out to learn more about it and to, again, it's not something that's out of the, out there, it's being done, and it's time for Illinois to get on board.
Yep, I will just echo what was said earlier. It really is a time for faith communities to step up and to lead in this time that we are in right now. If we're going to wait for, sorry if I offend anybody, if we're going to wait for the president to do it, if we're going to wait for anybody else to do it, we're going to be waiting a long time. And I don't know about anyone else. I'm tired of waiting. My sister said it earlier. Too many people are dying. Too many people are becoming homeless again in the richest nation on the planet. The one thing we should never have is homeless people and people who are hungry in the richest nation on the planet. And so the time is now. We've waited long enough. The time is now. And the faith community must lead the fight for justice, for equity, and for equality. And the Fair Tax Act embodies all three of those.
Thank you so much. You guys have been so inspirational. And I encourage all our audience members to just go out and vote. And with that, I will turn it over to Kay Mooney. Thank you all again.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for putting a human face on the challenges and needs we are facing. Thank you, Sarah, Reverend Dr. Pagán-Banks. Thank you, Reverend Sauder. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Mitchell, for your passion for justice, for equity. It shines through in your work and your words. Now we turn to a different subject, looking at how the resources raised by this tax reform would be distributed to people and services around the state. Our second panel includes, and please feel free to unmute yourself and join with video, Senator Don Harmon, who is the current president of the Illinois Senate. First elected in the fall of 2002, Senator Don Harmon has promoted a progressive agenda in the Illinois Senate, advocating for better opportunities for our children, greater access to affordable health care, improved government oversight and ethics reforms, strengthening civil rights, substantive environmental protection, and economic opportunity for all. Harmon has been a leader in the sweeping government reform to end Illinois' reputation as a pay-to-play politics. Thank you, Senator Harmon. The Reverend Dr. Marshall Elijah Hatch has been the senior pastor of the New Mount Pilgrim Missionary Baptist Church since 1993. He is a community leader and activist whose ministry has led or assisted in the development of more than 200 single-family homes in Chicago and the development of a new community health and fitness center, health clinic, and the Lawndale Christian Health Center, to list just a few of his accomplishments. a Merrill Fellow at the Harvard Divinity School, and the recipient of the Weston Howland Jr. Grant and Award for Civic Leadership from Tufts University. The Reverend Dr. Hatch currently serves as the Professor of Urban Ministry at Northern Baptist Seminary in Lombard. Welcome. And welcome back also Ralph Martire, the Executive Director of the Non-Partisan Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Our moderator for this panel is the Reverend Alan Taylor. Since 2003, Taylor has served Unity Temple as Senior Minister at Unity. He is the past president of the Community of Congregations, through which he has addressed immigration and racial justice issues. He is on the board of the Leaders Network, addressing the challenges of Chicago's West Side, and he also serves on the board of the National Alliance for Mental Illness, Metro Suburban Chapter. As you begin, I remind you to please share both from your wealth of knowledge and from the experience that you've had as individual. Thank you all for being a part of this, and I turn it over to you, Reverend Allen.
Thank you, Reverend Kay. Reverend Hatch is with us and has let me know that his video is disabled from his phone, if you're able to turn that on. The first question, so first of all, I just want to say how great it is to be here with you, Senator Harmon, Pastor Hatch, and
thank you,
Martire. It is really, I just want to acknowledge my admiration for your untiring, unflagging efforts, Senator Harmon, on this issue of fair tax. Some people think it's a new issue. I know it's something you've been working on for over a decade. And it's very exciting that we are at this place finally addressing this issue. And the first question I want to ask are, what are the current priorities for budgeting and spending in Illinois? And particularly for Pastor Hatch, what should be the current priorities for budgeting and spending in Illinois? Senator, could you start?
Sure, and I would compliment my old friend Ralph Martire. He did a very nice job of laying out the current predicament and the structural deficit, which is the first thing that we need to tackle. It's not a question that the fair tax is going to generate so much new revenue for new programs, but it's going to allow us to invest adequate amounts in education, early childhood programs, human services. It will allow us to pay off our backlog of unpaid bills and get to stable. And I think Ralph hit the nail on the head. The long-term regressive nature of our tax policy has led to the inequities in education funding, to the over-reliance on the property tax, and to shunting our responsibilities to fund our pensions for generations. So this is the first step to getting to normal, to making the required investments in education in particular, to putting downward pressure and eventually reducing property taxes.
Pastor Hatch?
Yes, thank you so much, Alan. And of course, as the senators mentioned, nobody's going to top Ralph for giving an informative presentation with numbers and the data. Of course, in the Illinois Constitution are safeguards for the protection of pensions for those workers who've worked for the state and are due justly the pension that has been promised. But also in the Constitution is the state's responsibility for education. And that's something that we have not lived up to. The support that the state Constitution requires for public education so that every student in every zip code has a fair and opportunity for the fruits of our state. And so we believe that education should be a number one priority that we must fully fund. And we can't do that without a fair tax, without a progressive tax. This tax is called progressive for a reason. It means the other one a flat rate is regressive, meaning that it harms or it places a greater burden on poor people disproportionately. And so if we're going to have a future where children's life options are not determined by their zip code, but a fair and equal access to a high quality education for every child in every part of the state, that is really a part and parcel what this fair tax is all about.
Well, thanks for the kind words, both of you gentlemen. I've been honored to have Don Harmon, President Harmon, as not just someone I've worked with in the legislature, but a personal friend for over 2 decades. And I got to tell you, he's always been progressive. He's always cared about doing the right thing well before he was an elected official. So it's great to have someone with that conviction serving in that role. And Pastor, I don't know what to say about you other than you've done so much good. You just keep doing what you're doing. And those words about me, could you pass them on to my wife? Because I don't think she agrees. That'd be awesome. The way I look at this is real simple. The numbers tell a story about priorities. 96 cents out of every dollar our elected officials in Springfield spend go to education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. I don't know how you identify priorities better than that. Clearly where they've wanted to put the money is where we want the money to go. They just haven't had sufficient revenue to invest. And a main reason they haven't had sufficient revenue to invest is our flat rate income tax doesn't respond to this tremendous growth in income inequality that we've experienced right here in Illinois. The Illinois specific data, I think, are eye-opening. Second thing that always comes up on this is, can we trust our elected officials to do the right thing with the money when it comes in? And the answer, once again, is clearly yes. And we have recent track record to go with. And so state had a temporary tax increase that became effective in 2011 and stayed in place for 4 years until Governor Rauner took office. When that temporary tax increase passed, state's accumulated deficit was approaching $16 billion. 4 years later, it was down to 5. The state elected officials literally made the decision to simply continue doing what they could do with services and pay down the debt. It's very counter to the narrative you see in the media, but by far and away, the decisions made by our elected officials in Springfield have been very responsible for the last decade and a half. And I feel that this is a crucial step forward. I appreciate President Harmon saying it doesn't solve all our problems, and he's exactly right. And I don't know any advocate for the fair tax that says that it does. But the truth of the matter, it's one of the 2 or 3 things we have to do, or we can't solve any of our problems. So it is crucial, and we need to get this done.
How are the needs of communities assessed and allocated now? And what change to this assessment would further ensure equity for our communities? So how are the needs of communities assessed and allocated now? And what changes would further ensure equity?
I would say that the assessment of community needs has not been done well enough historically. Ralph mentioned the historic change in our education funding formula, our allocation, where we now drive resources to the school districts that need it most based on the evidence, based on the likelihood of a good outcome for students in that school district. Reverend Hatch also mentioned the notion that a child's future is dictated based on the zip code in which they grow up. We need to end that. I think the pandemic in particular has revealed in stark relief the disparities in our healthcare system, and the life expectancy of someone growing up either on the Gold Coast or in Oak Park is significantly higher than someone growing up on the West Side in between. It makes no sense other than systemic racism built into our healthcare system and all of the structures that support that. So we're doing a better job of assessing community needs, but we still have a ways to go.
What changes to this assessment would further ensure equity? How should we be assessing and assessing our communities and allocating resources?
That's a question that's easy to answer in the master's course I teach on public policy, and far more difficult to answer in reality when you're talking about a political process. But I will say this: a system that has inadequate resources on the front end will make inadequate investments on the back end. So our starting point is we can't get to a level of investing in core services to the point where we meet demographically driven need until we have the adequate fiscal capacity to do that. So there's the tide of the fair tax, right? Start building your adequate capacity. But then to identify need, I mean, a lot needs to be done. And I appreciate President Harmon bringing up the evidence-based model. It actually provides a little guidance for what to do. So according to the evidence-based school funding formula, it literally looks at the research-based needs of every school district in the state, predicated on the unique student population that school district serves. Its percentage of low-income kids, English learners, special needs kids. And knowing the needs of those children academically, the model builds and invests in additional resources, excuse me, so the school districts serving those children have the capacity to implement the best practices that will result in them attaining higher levels of academic achievement. That kind of analysis can be done in literally every other area where the state makes major investments. What are the healthcare needs of the community driven by the specific population being served? What are the social service needs of that community driven by the population being served? And unfortunately, we don't make that kind of rational analysis too often at the state level. And one of the main reasons we don't is we don't have the resources to put into those communities once we do. And I appreciate one more thing that Senator Harmon said, which is absolutely true. You know, my organization has actually had an initiative on structural racism for 18 years now. And we've been in an organization for 20. And the reason we started so long ago with this initiative is when you look at the data, what you really see is a lot of our public systems, whether it's education or healthcare, which are designed or intended, I should say, to promote access to social and economic justice and or opportunity for everyone. That's their intended purpose, are actually designed in a way that not only don't accomplish that goal, but actually reinforce historic discrimination across racial, ethnic, and even classist lines. And so, you know, doing just a numbers-based analysis does set you free, because the data clearly indicate that that structural racism is built in to these core public systems. It can be fixed, but it can't be fixed unless we're willing to look at what the data and the evidence are telling us, and then we're willing to make the changes needed to reverse those problems and really create public sector systems that have the capacity to promote social and economic justice as intended.
Great. I have a question that's come from, oh, please, Pastor.
No, I was just going to add that Ralph is stating, of course, to put the resources in the places where they needed most, you know, just simply as clear as that. And so, you know, with the needs-based assessment, know which communities have the most need. We know that basing particularly education on property tax of those communities is going to inherently lead to us in the resources so that we can have, we can treat greater levels of equity are important. But I just want to say that, you know, people have been asking me every day in places I go, and I'm sure you all as well, when we look at the direction this country is going in and the choices that we have to make, what can they do? And voting for this fair tax means that we're looking, especially at our state, at a future that will provide, you know, a more equitable outcome that produces an inherent also greater levels of social stability. You know, instability socially and politically comes from this wide disparity of income and wide disparity of outcomes with of people. And so this is really a social justice issue for us. here in Illinois. We used to be a leader in these areas of social justice, and this fair tax is about reclaiming that leadership in social justice across the country.
Great, great. We have a question from someone who is watching. What do I tell someone that says Illinois should just declare bankruptcy? They don't trust Springfield to spend more money wisely and don't believe that taxing below $250,000 isn't next in the agenda.
You're
Well,
muted, Senator.
Thank you. I had background noise in the house. I muted myself so you didn't hear the kids running up and down the stairs. First of all, we can't declare bankruptcy. It's not an option. Second, even if we could, it is, in my view, an immoral effort to avoid obligations promised to people, primarily pensions. Third, even if we could, in other instances at the municipal level, the advocates for bankruptcy would be very disappointed because courts have generally sided with pensioners, but against, say, bondholders and other folks to whom the state owes money. If we were to default on those obligations, we would just put ourselves into a death spiral. I think Ralph did point out that our discretionary spending has been largely driven to the things that folks want us to spend money on: education, healthcare, human services, public safety. And finally, fair tax or not, the hardest vote in the General Assembly is to raise taxes on middle-class families. And passing the fair tax will make that no easier. So that is the biggest red herring argument of them all.
That's great to hear. I've got one last question, and that's how can those of us gathered support you and the legislature supporting this change? And how can all of us as faith communities rally to support?
Thank you for the offer to support those of us in the legislature. For better or worse, the work in the legislature is done. The General Assembly put the question on the ballot. It is now for the voters. It is now for the Illinois residents and for the political process. Reverend Brian Sauder asked you to all go out and find one person. I would suggest maybe you find 10 or 20 or 100. That's what it's going to require. This is not an easy thing to pass. To ratify the constitutional amendment requires 50% of everybody voting in the election or 60% of those voting on the question. This is not an easy thing to do by any stretch. So it is no longer in the hands of the General Assembly. It is now a question for the voters, and you all are the voters. So vote, and encourage everyone that might listen to you to vote as well.
Since I can't add anything to what President Harmon just said, because I think it's spot on, I will add it something just from a practical standpoint. We're in the middle of a very bad recession driven by the pandemic. People are going to claim you shouldn't raise taxes during a recession. However, this tax increase, this very specific approach to increasing taxes, is actually one of the best things you could do to counter the recession and help your state recover quicker. And that's not just me talking, that's Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. And here's why. The tax increase all comes from the wealthiest 3% in our state. Their incomes have been growing so tremendously over time that when you tax them a little bit more, they don't spend less in the economy. 68% of our economy is consumer spending. We are going to provide minimal tax relief to low and moderate earning families. They're going to take that tax relief and they are going to spend it in the economy. The money we raise from the affluent that we invest in services goes to covering the salaries of teachers, social workers, healthcare providers, correctional officers, et cetera, who are middle income families who spend it in the economy. So net, what will happen here is if we get this passed, our state economy will recover faster from this recession, which is precisely what happened during the Great Recession for every state that in fact raised taxes progressively and maintained its expenditures on services. And those states that cut spending hurt themselves and recovered slower. We have a report coming out on this next week, and hopefully you all will look at it, but please be armed that this is precisely the right time to approach our tax policy in precisely the way this legislation and amendment do it.
And I want to lift up the visionary work of the Leaders Network, of which Pastor Hatch is a founder and co-commissioner of, and has done so much work to support legislators in, including Senator Harmon, in moving our policies and laws to be where we need to be truly more equitable. And Pastor Hatch, I want to give you the last word about what do we need to do as people of faith.
Well, thank you so much. Listen, we need to support this fair tax. Number one, I mean, people, again, I ask, and you can get 10 of your closest friends to make sure that they vote and support this fair tax. This is really about moving the state forward progressively. And it's about giving relief to people on the bottom. And then it's about providing resources for the citizens who have the greatest need. Listen, I don't have to tell other people on this call, we got a very stark set of choices to make this fall. And that is what the future of the country is going to look like. Either we're going to move forward into perfecting the union and making it better and bringing everybody and lifting all of the boats, or we're going to turn ourselves into some variation almost of a system, an oligarchy where there are a few rich people and the rest of us are fighting over the scraps. You know, it's really now is the time for us to choose a direction. And Illinois can, again, make a choice that's going to fundamentally help change the way that we're able to distribute in our state and to create a more equitable and just society.
Great. Thank you, Pastor. And thank you for your leadership on this in our community and state. Senator Harmon, thank you for your leadership. And Mr. Martire, thank you for behind the scenes leadership and showing us how the fair tax is the most moral way to go forward. This is extremely inspiring for me personally, and I invite other people of faith, leaders of faith, to join me and to join Pastor Hatch and many others to say, let's be public and join the public square to acknowledge that people who have wealth need to give their fair share. It's in the Christian scriptures. It's the moral thing to do. May we move forward as a community of vision, of compassion, of justice. Thank you all for this time. Reverend Kay, thank you for this opportunity for us to.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you each for making time to speak to this important issue. Investing fairly in all our well-being is critical, and it starts with building capacity, paying attention to promoting social stability through reclaiming our leadership in compassion and equity as it comes through as justice. Thank you so much to each one of you for those words that I stole and cobbled together. We appreciate your candor and hope your work ignites this world. We recognize that we must be investing in the well-being of all by building that capacity. And now is your time to take action. First, As was already stated, vote. You might be getting a mailer in the mail. You might be going out and voting early, whatever. Vote, 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 vote. Get everybody you know to vote. Get them to register. Make sure that you register. Get out there. There has never been a time for more need for our state to be filled with equity and compassion that leads to justice. In this YouTube, underneath this video, there is a description area. You will see the show more. You may have clicked on it already. Please go and click on it again. There are actions that you can take. First, I want everybody that is watching this right now to click on that thing that will say that you will sign on as an individual supporter of the fair tax. Click it now. It doesn't take very long. Just open up a window and sign off. Once you've clicked and said that you will do something, you are much more likely to actually do it. So do it now. The other thing I want you to do is take a pen, take a piece of paper. You've got to have them someplace in your house. Write down 5 family members, 5 friends, 5 coworkers, 5 neighbors. Talk to these people. Tell them why the fair tax is such an important issue and on our ballot this year, and why it is that they need to vote for it, because you were inspired today to know the stories behind all of the inequity that is going on in our state, so that you can be that force forward to be inspiring others to vote for this. If people need to learn more about it, they can come back to this YouTube. They can watch it. They can watch other things online. There's plenty of information out there. But please, please, please write down 5 family members, 5 friends, 5 coworkers, 5 neighbors. You have people in your life that you can talk to. It just takes the courage to do it. The next thing I want you to do is, if you're really inspired, sign up to volunteer. There are phone banks that are going on and text banks that are going on. Write a letter to the editor. In that show more section, you'll see a link to phone banking. You'll see an email to volunteer with Vote Yes for Fair Tax. You'll even see an email for someone that would help you to write a letter to the editor. Get published. Make that your goal for the year. The other thing is, get a yard sign. Oh my gosh, they're going up everywhere, right? Everything. Everyone's election bid is up and there. Please order yard signs. Order them for the neighbors that you're going to talk to, for the family members you're going to talk to, for the friends and coworkers. Order yard signs and get them out there so people know this is an issue, know where you stand on the issue, and know that you're somebody that they can talk to if they have questions about this. There's so much misinformation that's coming out right now about all of this, all of the facts and figures around fair tax. Please get a yard sign. Let people know how you stand on this. As you take the time now to get to that show more and take these various actions, I want to hear one more person of faith talk about why this referendum is so important to us in this state. So Adam, if you would go ahead and show us the faith statement from Reverend Gastiger.
Hi, I'm Joe Gastiger, pastor at First Congregational in DeKalb, and I'd like to voice my support for the Fair Tax Initiative. Most of our social services for the old, the disabled, the poor depend on state funding, and our local schools in small cities like mine they get most of their budget from property and sales taxes, which hit people who can least afford it the hardest of all. If you've been out of work this year, if your restaurant had to close, if your local business has suffered thanks to the COVID epidemic, these bills that don't take any account of your income, your circumstances, will hurt you most of all. Without massive layoffs or drastic cuts that will come down hardest on the most vulnerable, we will never see property tax or any kind of tax reform at all. I stand for the fair tax as a Christian because my faith teaches me that God's justice is about social justice. God's justice is about the equitable distribution of God's resources. And I warn you, a passion for God's justice sets you against all of those systems designed by people in their own narrow self-interest to benefit the few at the expense of the many. today for our waitresses and our sales clerks and all those people who lost a lot this year. Please vote for a fair tax in Illinois. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of that. I am going to ask two people to come on now, because as Reverend Alan Taylor was alluding to there, and we heard up at the front of this, there's an opportunity for us to have actually the organizations that we belong to begin to talk about this issue, this very, very important issue, and to sign off as supporters of the fair tax. So Marion and Judith, I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how you were able to, in your organizations, get people to sign on. I will, as Judith is getting her video ready, I'll let you know that one of the churches in the North Shore Unitarian, just completed a vote by mail to endorse the fair tax as an organization, along with Unity Temple. So we have two Unitarian churches, but there are tons of organizations out there. So please, Marion, let us know.
Hi, everyone. So I happen to be the president of the Community Diversity Group of LaGrange. And for us, it was a very simple process to do an organizational sign-on for the fair tax. We simply discussed it at a budget meeting and decided that we as a group would support the fair tax, which enables me then, when I'm posting on our Facebook page, to post things that endorse the fair tax. So it was very simple, and I was able to sign up with some of the other groups that are promoting it, and then they can publicize our name as a supporter of the fair tax. Thanks for the opportunity.
Judith.
Yes, and at Unity Temple Unitarian Universalist Congregation, we had a longer process. We're a larger congregation. We're not just a small committee that can be more nimble. So we had a forum, and then we had 3 other meetings after that offered opportunities for congregational members to come and ask questions, to participate in a World Cafe format for everybody to talk and share their ideas. And then finally, we invited Reverend Karen K. Mooney to come and talk with us and cap off our efforts. We also did some phone calling among our members, and we also sent postcards just asking them to come to the special meeting that was required and to vote their conscience. So we did accomplish the required quorum, and it did pass. And we are very grateful to all the people that worked on this campaign and shared their ideas and shared their talents and shared their reservations so that we could work through so many of the things that people were struggling with and thinking about. But I am so happy and pleased that we advanced to that 3rd level of public endorsement. There will be, we've submitted a letter about this for our local journal, the Wednesday Journal. We've sent letters to Community Renewal Society. We're appearing here at this event to make a wide announcement that'll be on YouTube. And we'll continue to inspire as we work on other things. This has been a very active congregation in UU the Vote, which is the Unitarian Universalists National Organization advancing voting in this 2020 election. So thank you.
So thank you to Marion and Judith for your insights. I would love to see 10 people commit to ask your organizations to sign on as well. This might be an easy ask by just asking the board. It might be a little bit more complicated, but here's the deal. Once you've made that ask, you can be guaranteed that you will have conversations with people that have questions that you might be able to answer. And if you don't have the answers, you will also know where to send them for information. Go to Vote Yes for Fair Tax. There's a boatload of information there, including frequently asked question documents that you can download. I would love to see 10 people commit to go and ask their organizations to sign off on this. Even if the sign off doesn't happen, the commitment allows you to have those conversations that are potentially even more important, because people will get the right information that they need to be able to vote with this and vote with a clear conscience that they are bringing compassion and equity into our world. A religious person, Karen Armstrong, actually did a study of all major religions and religious tendencies, and she said that one of the core foundations of each faith is compassion. Compassion comes about and is lived in equity. So this isn't just a Christian issue. This isn't just a Muslim issue. This isn't just a Sikh issue. This is an issue for all people of faith, no matter how it is that you express your faith, even if your faith is one of humanism. That core of that faith has to do with compassion. Compassion leads to a desire for equity, and equity invariably leads to a desire and a lived outcome of justice. We join together as many, many diverse expressions of one mystery for the healing of our communities and the renewal of our lives. Please remember to advocate for these things that you value and get out the vote. Go again and look at that See More section on the video. There are tons of links there that you can use to sign on as individuals or as organizations, and to continue this work as you move forward with inspiration from these speakers today. I want to thank again Ralph Martire, Alan Taylor, Senator Harmon, Reverend Dr. Marilyn Pagán-Banks, Sarah Youssef, Reverend Brian Sauder, Reverend Joe Mitchell, Scott Metzger, Judith McDivitt, Marion Hunnell-Wilson, Chuck Ruth, Adam Groch, all people who work today to bring this forum to you. Go out and live your lives, and let us be about bringing forth, and the Reverend Dr. Marshall Hatch, who I believe had to leave already. Let us go out and be about living with joyful rebellion. Your joy is a rebellion against knowing that we are capable of making this world change. Thank you all so much, and take good care.